Welcome back to Pop Goes the Stack, the podcast that treats tech trends like change requests. Bold idea, unclear impact, definitely someone else's problem. I'm Lori MacVittie. Let's take a look at what's going on today. Today, Joel and I are joined by John Willis of DevOps and Deming fame. Hi, John.
Hey, great to be here. Yep, it's been a long time, Lori.
It has been a long time, but I'm glad that you could come. When I saw Deming in the subject line, I'm like, that is John, and we have to have him on for a discussion, right? Awesome. Yeah. So, of late, you're the author of AI CIO and Rebels of Reason, and you bring both a historian's perspective and real-world experience to AI, which is helpful because right now, most people are just yelling about it, making it up, right? AI isn't living in the labs anymore. We know that. It's landing smack in the middle of everything, including DevOps. So pipelines, automation, production systems, it's all in the places where seemed like a good idea at the time, turns into a 2 a.m. incident. So John has a knack for separating what's actually new from what's just history repeating itself, right? Patterns. And that matters because as AI shifts from tool to participant, a lot of what we think we know about delivery and operation starts to become murky. So today we're going to dig into what happens when DevOps meets autonomy. What works, what doesn't, why your pipeline might have opinions. So let's kick it off. Joel, I know you had a great question to kick us off.
Look, we've got John Willis here who went from early cloud evangelist to early containerization advocate to DevOps pioneer to now AI historian, which is like the tech equivalent of going from discovering fire to creating nuclear reactors. So you've seen and done a lot of things over the years, John. And I want to start with DevOps in particular. And we're tracking the rise of something a lot of people are calling AI ops, but it looks to me like an enhanced tool set for DevOps. What is different about DevOps now that AI has risen and is newly capable to perform autonomous actions?
Yeah, I think, there's two ways to look at this. One is that there are patterns, right? And, I was mentioning earlier, there was, we're at DevOps Days Atlanta, and some of the young people were talking about how new AI is and how confusing it is and how everything's terrible. And then they pointed to like, you DevOps folks, you figured it out. And I was like, no, not 15 years ago, we didn't. So one way to look at it is there are patterns, and you mentioned Deming, Lori, right? Like, there are things that are first principles of how we do things, how we do, how we apply critical thinking. And one of the problems with any of these new technology shifts, and AI being an interesting and very complex shift, it is that, that in the end of the day, that these are repeating patterns of things that we know. We have 100 years of people like Deming and Akoff and Senge and just a ton of resources about organizational dynamics. So that's one way to look at it, right? Is that like if we step back and say, how do we apply first principles to the technology? Because it's not about technology, it's about the humans, right? And all those things, they're thing I found early in my career, which was we thought we were inventing DevOps, but we were really is reinventing what Toyota did, which was reinventing what Deming did when he went over to Japan, right? And so that's one, is like understanding first principles, critical thinking, and the organizational dynamics around how humans deal with any technology. Then there is this operational authority shift where we've moved from sort of determinism, and the world was never really truly deterministic, but let's just for sake of argument, that the way we delivered software, in the DevOps age, right, is that we delivered software really fast. The DevOps was a catch-up mechanism, but it was reasonably deterministic in terms of how we created the pipeline, right? The SDLC, right? We did our sort of testing, we did our SAST, our DAST, all the things we did. And then we learned how to do audit properly, right? So those are, we called it DevOps automated governance. Now we live in a world of probabilistic non-determinism, right? And so this is the first principle, is that the question now when, if an organization wants to use, or an organization is bounded by regulatory controls, right? Whether it's inference or agent-based, you can't just put your head in the sand and say yes or no, because we saw that in cloud, right? Cloud, no cloud, no cloud. Wednesday at 4 p.m., yes, cloud, right? Like we can't do that with AI and agents, right? Like, we have to have a pragmatic approach. And then the question then is, are you willing to accept some type of risk? Because we could live in that deterministic world. And again, it was sort of a false hood anyway, but like we could say, this can never, ever, ever happen. And so what we would do is we'd say, here's all the things that to make sure this never, ever, ever happens. We'd have regulatory control, we'd have findings. But now it will happen, right? A sort of an answer, an answer that is regulated, just plain old inference. I'm not even talking about agents. There's going to be some probabilistics where the answer may be correct 99 out of 100 times, but there's going to be some percentage of risk. So the reality check then is an organization, if you're going to go into AI and you're going to have a chatbot that is going to give regulated answers, then are you being realistic about the actual risk profile that you're willing to accept? And so this changes everything about how we think about audit, because audit isn't like, it can never do this, you showed this evidence and we accept that you did this. This will probably happen, are you willing to accept it less than 5%? Right, and then when you get into agent, it's a whole new layer, because inference by itself is dangerous, right? The Air Canada example, right? Where they gave the wrong answer to somebody who like wanted to get a refund for his mom's funeral. There was a big lawsuit, front page of the Wall Street Journal. In the end, Air Canada tried to say it was AI. And well, sorry, folks, it's never going to be AI. It's going to be some corporate or legal entity. And then agents are a whole nother ballgame. So inference is important by itself, because if you're going to give answers, there's going to be a risk that the answers may not be correct. Now, there's tons of tools to work that out. But now in agents, now you got a whole nother level, because now you're sort of maybe mutating a production system, or you're executing multi-systems. And so there's just a whole lot of like new way of thinking, but starting foundation with like the question that you have to ask is, are you willing to accept the risk? Because if you're not willing to accept the risk, then you just can't use these tools.
So
I like that.
Yeah.
I was just the notion that I heard there is when my son started driving, right? We live in Wisconsin. You are going to hit a deer eventually. If you're not willing to take that risk,
That's right.
do not drive. It really, you have to approach it that way. So you accept up front.
And fortunately, leadership, it's part of that whole shift in thinking. Like the early day DevOps cloud started to sort of break down some of the never ever, we won't ever ever, we can never go to cloud, we can never deploy, we must have sort of like air gapped. All these things, we've deteriorated that over the years. But now we're at a fundamental shift of, no, now you have to deal leadership. You can't put your head in the sand and say, this can't happen. Because it will, like your deer, an example. It's going to happen. I mean, if you're going to embark on inference, which is what LLMs do, then there is a risk. And then your job then is to calibrate and try to safely mitigate that risk using a ton of tools like evaluations and guardrails and those things.
Right. So let's go back to the DevOps topic for just a second, because I'm really curious about one of the things that you said there. It seems to me that DevOps typical practice is to try to shorten the loop between human interaction and system action. So you create kind of a life cycle which is gated through humans, but shortens the loop as much as possible so that you can deliver quicker. It seems to me that AI, in the way that you're describing it, is a choice as to how much authority you grant to the system part of that loop. Is that correct?
Yeah. And there's this notion of what HITL, right? The human in the loop, and then there's this notion of human on the loop, right? And so I think it's there's a learning curve, right? Like, and that's the other thing too, right? That what people are not doing, I sort of joke that I know you guys cover a lot about MCP and stuff, and I think it's an important conversation to have. But I think when I walk into large organizations now, the most critical sort of audit question is, should we do CLI or MCP? And like, those are the wrong questions, right? The real questions are, if we're going to use agents, are we even scoping out the sort of the scope of, like, is it an agent that does read only? Is it an agent that does write and mutates? Or is it an agent that executes? And then, like, let's have that discussion as just being binary. Agents yes, agents no. So if it's read, maybe we learn in this sort of HITL to HOTL, it sounds kind of weird, is that, like, we get better and better at learning about the, it's like the remediation systems of the last decade, right? Mm-hmm. Early on, there was a lot of sort of pushback on how much you'd let a remediation system. But we learned over time that we can do auto remediation for incidents, calls, and we've added more authority. Well, again, it's not like next Wednesday we do agents that execute MCP that make, billion-dollar requests accidentally or delete whole databases, which actually seems to happen every day now. It's like, how do we work through learning that authority, calibrating, okay, we've gotten better at this. This seems more consistent. Let's move on to the next level, right? Yeah. And I think it's the same feedback loop, right? It's a feedback loop, but it's a feedback loop on operational authority shifts.
Well, you're actually talking about setting up boundaries in which the agent can operate. You can read only. And then if you try to violate that, if that agent says, yeah, but I really want to write, you can just, you could put controls in to go, hey, you've exceeded your authority. I'm going to stop it, right? Yeah. The boundaries around what you're trying to do, and you put those in place before to help mitigate the risk, as you were saying. That's one of the tools you can use.
No, I think, and then you start thinking about atomic nature of a what is the atomic nature of an agent, and then I think containment becomes an interesting discussion. You have to get the sort of principles of like let's just not talk about we're going to do agents or not going to do agents, or we're going to do AI or we're not going to do it. Let's talk about, like, it's the same problem we had with cloud, right? Everybody ran to the cloud, and then the first thing they realized, which was, we probably should have had a data classification program, before we ran it. So, like, we need to think about, like, what is our classification? What is our scope? And so I think that, working through all that, then you get to a point where once you have that straightened out, now you can start thinking about containment, right? And what is the best containment level? So if I'm going to have read or write authority, maybe it's Wasm. Maybe it's eBPF. I'm working with a professor who's doing intelligent traffic systems, and he's trying to run agents at the edge, and so he's exploring with eBPF. Or I think there's a lot of interesting ways that we can get to containment once we have an overarching discussion about what actually we want to do with AI.
Right. So the two steps are first of all figuring out what authority to grant, which to me sounds a little bit like how many rights are we giving to our DevOps intern? It's the same basic decision process that you go through when you're trying to figure out, whether to trust and grant authority to someone. This is just something that you trust and grant authority to. And that trust level will, of course, change over time. And then you have to think about, okay, what if things go completely wrong with that process? How do I contain that process? How do I contain the blast radius of potential erroneous change within that loop? So I totally get what you're saying there.
I think I was just going to say that that those are some new things we need to think about, particularly with agents. Is like, do we have escalation policies in an agent? Do we have kill switches? Right. These are things that new ways of thinking about, and there's nothing more, new types of metrics that we need to think about: logging, replay, traceability, explainability. And we overuse that. But like, if we're going to have agents make multitask decisions that have consequences, we better be able, from an audit perspective, explain why it made those decisions.
So, John, I want to ask you a historical question, if I could. I did read your book, Rebels of Reason, which is a great
cool. Awesome.
rundown of how AI got to where it is on the backs of lots of unsung work. I want to ask this question, because you've seen it all. You've done a little bit of everything in your career. What feels new in artificial intelligence but actually isn't?
Ooh.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that one of the things that I think, so, I wrote the book because I was just fascinated with storytelling, right? And when I wrote my Deming book, my goal was to write sort of storytelling nonfiction, like how would Michael Lewis write a book about Deming? And then I was like, okay, what's next? Okay, AI, how would Michael Lewis write a book? But since then, I've thought a lot about like, what did I learn from writing that book? And one is the patterns of, if you go back to, we'll spend way too much time, but like if you go back to, AI starts with formulated logic from Aristotle, right? And then it turns into Boolean algebra with Boole. And then it's Ada Lovelace turning into a program, and so on and so forth, right? And then you get into neural networks and all that. And I think one part of that is, like, there's a lot of stuff going on with Jan LeCun right now. He's in my book, right? And he's got this JEPA, and Feifei Li has a New World. And so there's this, there's a lot of people thinking LLMs are going to hit a peak, right? And I think understanding the history of how we got to, deep neural networks will help us better understand where we go next. The other thing, too, is how humans react to technology. Right, and so that's a secondary conversation. Like if you think about IBM's sort of Watson and some of the early, even the AlphaGo stuff, right? There is always this human element. So as I think about the book that I wrote, Rebels of Reason, it is this combination of this interesting technology of, at the end of the day, it's bits and bytes and Boolean logic, right? The deep neural networks are just firing of Boolean networks, right? And but then there's a sort of underlying story of how humans interact with those, and I think as you read the story, there's always this like, what will they think of next, or this has got to be the end all be all, right? From a robot in the 30s to the Deep Blue to all these things that every time we get to it, we think, wow, this is crazy. What is going to do? And then, so we're in one of those right now. We're in those, and it'll change. There'll be some new patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems to me that human attachment to technology is the thing that is not different about AI. We become very attached to the technologies that are either patterned to behave or look like us, or interact with us. Right? People get very attached. And I think that that is not new about AI. I think that's been a constant presence.
And that's the story of technology in general, right? Like right now we're in this fluorescence of like, oh my God, this is like new. It's different. And like at some point we're going to look back and like, oh, AI was just like the computer age and the cloud age. And, and that will happen. It will happen. It's just a new way of technology. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's a new way to do it. And part of it is we fear change.
That's right.
And the other part is we embrace change, right? So there's that mix, right?
Paradox,
so, yeah. And we're getting out of time here, but I do want to have takeaways, right? What should someone listening, if they're in the enterprise and they're thinking about agents or they already have one running, what should they be thinking about? What should they be doing actively before, I don't know, it orders pizza for the whole world?
No, I think if you're in sort of a role where a CI, you're sort of somebody who has influence to a CIO, right? And maybe CEO, depending, but in the large regulated corporations, right? That's our first line of defense. Is in theory the CIO should actually have a handle on all these things, and so if you're somebody like somebody who's like an influencer or sort of, I'm trying to think of the terms that people use, but like a sergeant of arms or whatever that reports, like, go to the coffee pot right now, drink coffee, take couple of deep breaths and go back and like literally try to force your organization, your CIO, to sort of like, let's step back for a minute. But I mean, it's the common sense thing. It's the critical thinking. Is what are the things that we know are common to all technology transformations, and like work your way out of that, as opposed to being in this firefight of, well, these people are using Cursor and we got a contract with Copilot and they shouldn't use agents, and what happened to the database that got. I mean, yeah, those are all important things, but they confuse what we know are the things that at an organizational level, especially in a regulated business. We need to step back. What are first principles? How are we doing critical thinking? What do we know about organizational design and discovery from hundreds of years of knowledge? And it all sounds cliched, but it's not. it's what we when we do it right, that's what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I think my takeaway from this discussion is that it is safe to pause, step back, and consider things for a moment in the context of the practices you already hold and the ones that you want to improve upon. That it's tempting to kind of go and try to pursue things because they're the next hottest thing, but they may not be the right thing necessarily for your organization, which is what a CIO has got to analyze, I would guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, it's that firefight, getting out of that firefighting, and it's hard. We all know this is hard, right? Like it is easy, you got a CEO screaming and hollering that their competitors are using AI. How come we're not? We've got vendors coming in and promising the world, right? These are like all these things. And the true leaders step back, they go to the coffee pot, they take a couple of deep breaths, and they pause for a minute to try to figure out like what is sort of common to all this that happens all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
I like that. I think the takeaway, right? Your talk about risk, right? There is risk. Decide what risk and how much you're willing to accept at which step. Step back, go, I'm willing to take this risk right now, and then move forward. But also consider that you are handing authority to basically a really smart script. So set up some boundaries and make sure that you can actually manage that risk as you move forward. AI is not going anywhere. You can step back, have some coffee, take a deep breath, and then move forward safely and quickly. If you do it safely.
I was asked on a podcast recently, what would be your recommendation to a 90-day plan to a CIO for AI? I'm like, my recommendation is not have a 90-day plan. Like that's ridiculous, right? Like, I don't know, is it a week? Is it like 300 days? I don't know. Like, let's figure it out, right? Yeah.
I like that. I wish we could talk more, but that is a wrap for Pop Goes the Stack. Subscribe now so you're ready when the next can't miss innovation shows up in your architecture diagram.